Okay, we're live.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is Jason Thomas with Skeleton Key. This is a re-recording. We had a few recording difficulties back on February 29th when we did this webinar live. We hope you enjoyed the live version, and there's been a couple of minor changes and a correction to a slide or two. So we hope you enjoy the recording as well. Again, I'm Jason Thomas with Skeleton Key. We're a platinum-level FileMaker Business Alliance company, authorized FileMaker trainer, and a member of the Apple Consultants Network and Microsoft registered partner headquartered in St. Louis. Today, we're going to be covering choosing the right deployment model for a FileMaker Go application. One of the beauties of FileMaker and FileMaker Go is the ease with which you can get mobile users connected and productive. No matter how easy it is, though, there's still factors you need to consider as you choose a deployment model. And choosing the right one is essential. So Mark Richmond's going to walk us through that today. Before we dive in, though, we need to thank our hosts, the FileMaker Academy. Skeleton Key is proud to be a charter member of the FileMaker Academy. FileMaker Academy is a consortium of leading FileMaker development companies in the United States. All FileMaker Academy companies are platinum-level FileMaker Business Alliance members and really represent the best of the best in FileMaker development. Our purpose is to further educate FileMaker users and developers and to encourage the best practices and foster further adoption of the software. So a little bit of housekeeping that on the recording is maybe less important, but if you have questions, you can get a hold of us, probably not so much by raising your hand here, but certainly by shooting us an email, info@skeletonkey.com. We'd love to hear them, so please ask. And now to introduce the featured speaker, Mark Richmond. Mark is the president of Skeleton Key, a FileMaker certified developer, FileMaker authorized trainer. He's a frequent presenter at FileMaker's Developer Conference and the author of several how-to guides. In addition, Mark's the 2011 recipient of the Outstanding Contribution to the FileMaker Community Award. On top of that, Mark is a great guy to know and a great boss to have. So without further ado, let me pass it off to Mark.
Thanks, Jason. I will note that even though that we're re-recording this for the purposes of posting it and sharing it with everybody on YouTube and such, we did have an opportunity to splice on some of the questions that were asked by the live audience on the day we presented. So please, by all means, as you go through, you may find a couple of your questions answered at the end, and then we'll be sure to share that email address and other ways to reach us if you want to follow up after watching. With that, I'm going to dive right in. We've got a lot of ground to cover. So first of all, my agenda. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the first two issues here, which is making sure we're all clear about why deployment matters, and in particular, what does the platform present as obstacles or opportunities. The iOS platform is definitely different than the desktop and laptop and server platforms that we're used to working with exclusively when working with FileMaker solutions. And so we're going to discuss why the environment that you're in sort of brings up some of these deployment considerations. We're then going to talk a little bit about defining performance to make it clear, what kinds of factors could when combined with the iOS platform issues, be impacted, and how do you actually measure performance. We're not going to spend a lot of time on either of those two topics. I just kind of want to set the stage and be clear why we're talking about deployment options, and so everyone understands why I even think that these different choices you have to make matter. You'll note on the previous slide, which I'll go back to here briefly, there is a mention of a TechNet article that was just released actually on the same day that we did this original webinar, Designing Faster iOS Database Apps. It speaks specifically to a number of the issues about defining what performance is in a little bit more detail, and gives also specific recommendations within your FileMaker Go applications about what you can do to combat those bottlenecks. But the main idea here is set the stage so we can talk about the third bullet. What are the different models for deployment, and how do you pick the right one? And this isn't necessarily intended to say that these are the only options for deployment or that we've really gone into deep depth in any one of them, because if you choose a model, you're certainly going to have more questions than we're going to cover here. But my hope is to kind of provide you with the 5 or so choices as frameworks for you to consider, and then look to the actual application you have and see which one's the best fit. So with that, let's dive right in. So the iOS platform, first of all, let's talk about the good things about it. A highly portable platform for consuming your database applications. The touchscreen provides a different way of interacting than we really ever used before, and as we see now with other iOS devices like the iPhone that preceded the iPad, this is becoming the sort of standard way of interacting with applications, more so than any other previous technology ever pushed us towards touchscreen. So you certainly have to take into consideration the fact that this is a portable device. It has a touchscreen interface. It provides options for capturing images and signatures, which is a great opportunity for incorporating those functions into your FileMaker applications. It also has the ability to interoperate with other applications on the iOS device. There's been a lot of traffic to one of our blog posts that Greg Lane put out, specifically about integrating with barcode applications early after Go was released. And since then, there's been a lot of options to use both mail and web kits and other kinds of functionality available on those devices to be able to exchange and share data with your FileMaker applications. Again, something that was often very hard to do and more complex to do and required peripherals to do on laptops and desktops, and now is built right into the device. And all this adds up to really an unprecedented user experience. So what that means is that your customers, your end users, are going to really want, if they can, to leverage going to be different than the kinds of improvements and things we've been used to, performance factor-wise, dealing with when it comes to laptops and desktops being the primary place we put a FileMaker client. So let's just go from top to bottom. First of all, the processor. On desktops and laptops, you have sometimes dedicated processors doing dedicated things, or you can have multiple processors at fairly high speeds with multiple cores. And the processor options on these iOS devices is significantly more limited. There's not choices. They can't be upgraded. They have a lot of work to do because they do everything. They're not really specialized for any one particular task. They consume less power, and they have less speed. So all of these mean that activities and functions that are processor intensive are going to be, by their very nature, slower on these devices. And you can see that in some of the different things you might have done in Go, where they just don't seem to sort records or do certain things the way you'd expect them to. And when those are locally stored on the device is doing all that. It's also, of course, managing memory. It's also, of course, managing the graphics engine. So it has a lot of other jobs to do. Memory, there's less of it. These devices have a fixed memory footprint. You can't add more chips to make them bigger. I'm not talking about storage, like how many gigs they can hold in terms of video. I'm talking about the amount of memory they have to actually work with your apps. And that memory is used for a number of different things. It's caching data. It's holding on to previously used apps as you switch between apps so that they can be restored more quickly. It's also working the active processes that you're managing and manipulating. And so as a result, there's a lot of opportunity for you to consume all of it. If you have too many applications running, if you are working with very large data sets, data caching can consume the available space, and these things can lead to slow performance, and it can also lead to, in worst-case scenarios, an actual application just failing or crashing. So you need to be sensitive when you use these devices to the amount of memory that's available to you and what your expectations are for these mobile apps. Storage is another item that's at a premium. Even an iPad or an iPhone with the maximum amount, 96 gigs or 64 gigs or whatever that particular device offers, it still has a lot of other stuff it has to keep on there, not to mention all the applications and the operating system. Applications like FileMaker, we know, create temp files. That's one of the ways that they allow remote users to feel like they're connected on the LAN. And that's by caching a lot of data, not just into memory for the recently used stuff, but also to the temp file on the storage device for anything that maybe I haven't used recently, but I've pulled down from the server. The fact that I'm going to also have movies and videos and TV shows and music and photos and all these other kinds of things on the storage device means that, like you've seen if you've ever had a laptop with lots of music on it, that space runs out really quickly. Lack of space can lead to a lot of churn, meaning that you're constantly reading and writing from the temp file because the temp file is smaller than you need it to be. And this is something you don't control. That FileMaker does automatically, so if it's got a tight space to work with, it'll work with it, but you'll feel it in the performance. And the other is that you could easily have trouble if you bring a very large, let's say 1 gigabyte FileMaker file directly onto the device. If it was to be fully temped into the temp file, it would be another gigabyte at least. And so that could very easily eat up a significant portion of space on an iOS device with a small storage footprint. The network is probably the biggest obstacle of all, and that has really much to do with the fact that by their very nature, the types of networks that are consumed by iOS devices are narrower or thinner. They have less pipe to offer than we're used to. We're used to 100 base T or gigabit at the desktop level. Or you're used to Wi-Fi networks that we already know can be relatively unstable and interrupted easily. I think the example I gave was when I did the original presentation was we've seen environments where wireless networks that were otherwise traditionally stable would suddenly fail at lunchtime. And after a little bit of research, discovered it was microwave ovens in the break room that were causing enough interference to interrupt the Wi-Fi signal. Nothing we could point a smoking gun at, but most of Wi-Fi networks and 3G networks and now 4G networks that are going to be available for these devices, by their very nature, are subject to all kinds of conditions and interruptions. They have to accept a certain amount of interference. That's just the way the FCC designs those bandwidths and those the options there. They have relatively slower speeds. If we're using public internet, like going through Verizon or AT&T, there's a number of different paths across a network that could be taken. This is a great thing for allowing networks to self-heal and route traffic different ways to get to their destination, but it also can introduce significantly longer wait times as packets make a round trip from device to server and back. And there's there's drop spots. There's a couple spots on my way home every day that I can guarantee I'll drop a call. They're just dead zones. And all of these things kind of constrain the amount of bandwidth that's available, the relative latency that you're going to experience, and the general reliability of these networks. And this is true both inside the office on your Wi-Fi as well as outside in the public world over 3 or 4G. And then, of course, the display. As great a thing as the touch screen is, and as great as a resolution as these devices offer, it's a smaller screen, has a different aspect ratio. It supports dynamic rotation, and it has approaches to rendering which may be a bit arcane and are really not a topic we want to cut into too detailed here. But it means that as you're developing sensitivity to the demands you're putting on the rendering engine, the graphics engine that actually draws that, will draw on processor time, it will draw on memory. And so, again, the performance document that I mentioned previously on TechNet that I'll reference toward the end of the presentation as well, both get into that in more detail. But these are all different factors that we're going to be considering as part of the landscape when we talk about the different options available to you for deployment. How will it affect processor or memory or storage? What kind of impact does it have on your reliance on the network? And similarly, from a display perspective, what kinds of solutions are going to be best to have display demand be local versus over the WAN? And most of the time, these obstacles combine together to create deployment scenarios that are better suited for one approach or another. Let's talk a little bit about then performance. So we need to worry about our deployment model because performance is going to be dramatically affected depending on how we position the files relative to the server or the clients relative to where the files are. Graphic responsiveness I was just talking about with the display. This is basically how long it takes to wait for the screen to redraw or to refresh. And this is a combination of elements that affect this. What kinds of objects are you using on the layout? Are they native FileMaker objects or are they inserted graphics? If they're inserted graphics, are they optimized? Is the file that they are contained in local to the device, or is it coming across the WAN? So they have to actually come across the network before you actually even get a chance for them to be rendered. And general things like this. So there's definitely some design choices that are being made here in terms of how your layouts look and how you're overlaying objects and so on. But there's also a question of where are those layouts stored, and are they stored remotely to the device or locally to the device, and what does it mean if you want to do it one way or the other? Data movement is a topic I've been talking about now for a few years in the FileMaker community, and a lot of this comes down to understanding the general behavior of FileMaker. I'd strongly recommend looking to our blog. Skeleton Key's blog has got some articles there about developing for maximum WAN performance and understanding some of the basic concepts there. And I know that we have some information up in TechNet about that as well, and there's been DevCon performances in previous years for which you may have slides, and there'll definitely be some DevCon sessions this year. I know John Thatcher is doing another Under the Hood session, and I'll be doing another session on the basics of data movement and how that can affect WAN performance. The gist of the idea here is that, again, just like graphic responsiveness, where you have what kind of data and when you access that data, and whether it's located on the device somehow in a file or stored remotely, can all really have a dramatic impact on performance. And so while we're not going to get into the details here, how your schema is organized, how many fields you have in the table, when you show what found set are all development techniques you need to be sensitive to in order to get the best performance out of your solutions as well. And that can be helped or mitigated somewhat by choosing a deployment model that takes advantage of what you need to do for data movement or helps you overcome an obstacle in how your data moves. So we'll talk about specific examples for both these first two bullet points as we go through the different 5 different scenarios. The last one is really not mentioned in the TechNet article at all that I referred to, but really something that plays an important part in making deployment option selections, which is not everybody who's developing in FileMaker Go has been developing in FileMaker for a very long time. If you're relatively new to FileMaker or you consider yourself an intermediate or advanced developer, but some of these techniques about dealing with all these different variables seem a bit scary to you, you'll want to factor in how hard will it be to change your development style so that you can be sensitive to graphic responsiveness, or so you can be sensitive to data movement, or so that you can manage multiple files in a solution. If these are techniques and issues for you that are going to be new, you need to think about whether or not that deployment model is going to be hard for you to maintain and administrate over time. It's not just setting it up in the first place, but it's maybe continuing to deploy it over time to new users, or upgrading it when it goes through some kind of overhaul or a new feature gets added, or even just maintaining accounts. All of these things can become more complex, and if those are not within your wheelhouse or comfort zone, you may need to seek external support or help, or you may need to up the ante on your own individual administration skills or development skills. So we'll factor this in as well when we talk about the different deployment scenarios, which ones are harder or easier to develop. And all that, of course, is a bit subjective because you may be familiar with all these different deployment scenarios. But I wanted to give you sort of my 2 cents shooting from the hip opinion about which of these development approaches is easier or harder based on the common experience most of us have, which is working with FileMaker natively, either on a local desktop or laptop, or working with FileMaker over a LAN between a FileMaker client and a FileMaker server. So again, there's that document. I'd recommend taking a look at it. It'll talk about a variety of sort of direct development techniques you can approach, and it'll raise a couple other issues related to performance you might want to consider. With that all said, I'm going to dive right into the deployment options themselves. So like I said, there's 5 that I'm going to cover. There may very well be more. Some of these could certainly be seen as very similar to one another, but I've picked them because they seem to be ones that we're running into frequently as we talk to and work on solutions and talk to other developers. They seem to address some of the common security or deployment options and infrastructures that are already out there. And so they seem sort of current and relevant to what we're trying to do as we transition from FileMaker Pro on a LAN to FileMaker Go on a WAN. And throughout, I'll be using this little legend of icons to reference. Anywhere you see a little purple database symbol, that represents an actual FileMaker file. Whether that FileMaker file contains data, or whether that FileMaker file is just an interface file, like in a separation model, or just a file that stores graphics or something, we'll be discussing that as we go case by case. But it means that there's a FileMaker file or FileMaker files hosted at that location. We'll use this generic icon to represent a FileMaker server. It doesn't matter for our examples whether these are server or server advanced. None of these solutions and deployment options we talk about address anything related to web publishing. So this is all native FileMaker Go and native FileMaker Pro, consuming native FileMaker files hosted on a FileMaker server or directly on a FileMaker iOS device with FileMaker Go. We'll have a sort of a generic-looking icon here for any iOS device. So if it runs FileMaker Go, that's the icon you'll see. That none of the examples and discussions we're going to have really have a significant impact about which iOS device you're using, other than, of course, you need to have, it doesn't matter to you if it supports and how it behaves over 3G if you don't have a data plan and you can't use 3G. So your mileage will vary depending on whether or not you're connecting over Wi-Fi, whether you're connecting over 3G or 4G, and the device in particular that you have. Similarly, the network here is a simple cloud symbol, and that's going to mean and represent a lot of different kinds of networks. As we get into examples, you see that I very rarely draw routers or switches or even firewalls. There's only one example where we really kind of throw the firewall out there, but there may very well be other types of network devices that are part of this network cloud. There could be all different kinds of networks as well. There could be Wi-Fi networks, 3G networks, 4G networks. There could be a T1s or public internet or your local coffee shop. It could even be a LAN, like everything sort of inside the house. My goal of using this icon is to say that you don't know. It's kind of a big, fuzzy cloud. You're not a network person. All you know is that somehow this device can get to that server and get to that file via the network. And so we'll talk about in which instances what kind of network I'm referring to. And then finally, there's a firewall symbol, which is relevant for our two-server example, the second bullet there. So when we get to that, we'll talk about why we called that out and drew attention to it. What you won't see as we go into these next drawings are really, for the most part, a lot of arrows sort of going back and forth as data moves, let's say, from the iOS device back and forth to the FileMaker file. There's a bit of an assumption there that it's clear that this is all about moving data from wherever it resides to a FileMaker Pro or FileMaker Go client. And so rather than have every drawing have arrows showing data moving, you can just assume it's part of every picture that we look at. So let's dive in. Fully hosted, one server. So there's going to be 3 slides for each of these. The first is we're going to just kind of make sure you're clear what we're talking about. The second slide, we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of this particular deployment model. And then the third, we're going to talk about what kinds of solutions or what kinds of criteria might be relevant for this kind of solution. Which things fit for this? And again, all that's somewhat subjective, but it's based on a fair amount of research and discussion with other developers to get their 2 cents about where they've seen deployment models fit the best. So in a fully hosted one-server situation, we're talking about your traditional FileMaker deployment model, the one we've all known and loved for a while. And that is you have a client on a device, in this case an iOS device, FileMaker Go. It could just as easily be a laptop or some other device over here running FileMaker Pro. There's a network that connects them. We're not really quite sure what it is. It could be, like I said, Wi-Fi or LAN or WAN. We don't know. But the FileMaker file resides on the FileMaker server. So in this traditional model, all the data is on the FileMaker server. There's some kind of network that exists between that FileMaker data and the iOS device. This is what we're all used to pretty much developing in. And so what is this? What are the pros? Well, the best thing about this is we already know how to do this. In fact, many of us, when we got FileMaker Go, simply pointed it at our FileMaker server, and we're wonderfully surprised to be able to log right in and start using our solutions with little or no modification. That's what Jason was talking about. It's really easy to get Go on a device. It's really easy to get from Go into your databases, and it's really good to be able to do the basics. But most of us test that when we're at our office. Then we go home and we try it, and it's very different because the deployment model for this is very sensitive to network performance. Everything's on the server, so there's no way to get anything to the Go client without sending it across the network. Every screen, every script, every piece of every record that ever is needed by that Go client has to move across the network. So if the network is a problem, if the network is constrained, you're going to have a serious performance issue on your hands. So what kinds of solutions is this good for? Well, it's usually good for what I would consider to be contained environments. These are like, we don't need people working all over the country or working from airports and stuff. These are people who are working within this environment and usually on a Wi-Fi where we're not worried about factors we can't control. We're not worried about the public internet. We're not worried about microwave ovens that we aren't controlling or being able to not use or to somehow shield. We're not going to have to worry because it's contained and controlled. So classrooms are great for this, for attendance or grading. Point of sale within an actual store where the store is a controlled environment. Inventory in a warehouse where you can put as many Wi-Fi hotspots as you need to and know that there's going to be little interference. Or event registration, so that if you wanted to have people walking around with iPads or iOS devices within the lobbies around the various parts of the event, being able to take information from attendees or registrants. These are all environments where the one server can work because the network effects can be managed because of the contained environment. They're usually good for when we have LAN environments for laptops and desktops. They're great when we have Wi-Fi based environments. If we're relying on 3G or 4G, that's not going to be such a great fit for this, simply because we're not going to be able to rely on that network. This needs as reliable a network as we can get for an iOS device, which would be a Wi-Fi network, and one that's under our management, not one that's under a public or a private other entity like our customer's network when we're visiting or the local Starbucks or something. The next example we have is a two-server setup. Now, this is a bit of a twist on something we've seen before. It's got two FileMaker files, and of course, your solution could have even more than two, but at least two. One which we'd call the master file, the main file, which is sitting on a server behind a firewall. This file is where the real database lives. And then on the other side of the firewall, we have a lighter file. This file might be doing any number of different kinds of things, but it's also on a FileMaker server. And the idea here that we've seen in examples, I want to say the Austin Conference Center used a similar model to this, and I welcome any of them who watch this. If I've got this wrong, please send me an email and let me know and correct it, and I'll issue a retraction or a clarification. But what I understand that they may have done there, and I've also seen us look at as options for other customers, is rather than have to take these iOS devices that were in the conference center using a Wi-Fi network and let them penetrate the the firewall to get to the main database, they wanted to avoid some of those conflicts. For example, maybe they didn't want to have to put VPN software on these devices to let them through the firewall safely. Maybe they didn't want to have to add the extra layer of network transit. Not only am I going over Wi-Fi, but then I also have to go through a firewall. I mean, firewalls do packet inspection. Firewalls often have narrower bandwidth on their in and outbound ports than the LANs on either side of them. So you could have like a gigabyte LAN here with a 100 base T connection here, or even a 10 base T if the firewall's old enough. And that just means more hops. Every packet's got to go through multiple points to get back and forth. Maybe they just didn't want to let people using these iOS devices have access to the master file. And maybe they just didn't want them being able to see all the records, or didn't want them to see all the tables, or maybe they didn't want to have to manage their logins here. Maybe they wanted to have logins here with only a certain subset of tables and only a certain subset of records. There's any number of reasons why you might want to separate files in this deployment. This is not the standard way people usually approach the separation model. Normally, the separation model is invoked because people want to put user interface and scripting in a light file that they can deploy separately from the data and the data structure. Those are usually in situations, let's say, where the user interface and the scripting that the user uses are going through rapid and regular changes, and so it allows them to frequently reissue those files and even work on separate versions of those files without ever having to contend with the large data set behind the scenes. Imagine if I had 20 gigs of data in here, but this was only a 10 meg interface file. Anytime I want to make these changes, I don't have to re-import 10 gigs or 20 gigs of data. But that's not really why we would consider a separation model here. We could consider it for the same reasons as you'll see in some of the other options, but the main reason here is we want to be able to mitigate iOS devices coming into a private network or accessing an entire database or having security privileges that allow them access to the main database. And we want to project that functionality with greater controls and restrictions closer to them on the other side of the firewall into a DMZ or outside the firewall entirely. So the pros: no need to use VPN on the iOS device. Anything else about this is really more of a network administrator's concern. Yes, it means your iOS devices won't technically be transiting, sending traffic across onto your LAN. And yes, we'll eliminate that extra potential bottleneck at the firewall side if there even is one. But the main issue here, I think, is it just kind of makes it simpler, at least at the iOS device level, to not have to add additional configuration to the device. You can grab a device out of your pocket, put FileMaker Go on it from the App Store, and then start working and connecting to the database. No additional configuration or security required, at least at that end. Downsides of this model, it's still very sensitive to network performance. Everything's still moving across that network there between the iOS device and the server that it's talking to. Those same concerns as we have with the one server model. The other thing is that this can be a little bit more complicated to develop. Managing accounts can also be more complicated. It may be nice that I can have separate accounts here than I have here if, in the scenario I described, these are one set of users and these are another. But what if you're using it from outside and you're also using it from inside? Now you have an account in two places, and is this server able to access the Active or Open Directory that's on the other side of the firewall? Is your domain administrator familiar enough and talking to your network administrator to make sure that this server can be part of the domain even though it's outside the firewall? All of that can add some complications for you. You may have to manage accounts here one way and manage them here the other way, and that could be a benefit or it could be a not such a great thing. So I'll treat it as a con because it adds complexity. It's not as easy as just a single solution hosted on a single server. Our next example, so what are the examples and usage scenarios, the parameters that you might consider when doing fully hosted with 2 servers? Again, I think very good for contained environments. Because of the network impact, the ability to use LAN and Wi-Fi for your users, Wi-Fi obviously for the iOS devices, means that you're not going to have to worry about those interruptions, or at least you'll have more control over the environment in which they're taking place. Another good example is when we have security concerns. Any database where there's a security concern about how much of the data is made available, or whether the main database file is available, or whether the users are being able to transit the main network, all of these raise the possibility that splitting your FileMaker solution into a main file and a pilot or an external file that allows you to have very strict control over that makes this a candidate for this kind of model. So scenarios we've seen this be useful in. Healthcare, where they might want to segregate how much PHI is shared or de-identify information when it's shared, even though it may be fully identified on the back end. Or where you may just want to share a subset of information, so not let them just search the main database, but they search the main database and then only the 3 or 4 records they need are brought forward, and there's no risk that they could possibly stumble into other records. You also might have subcontractors, so you may have people who are potentially working, let's say, out in the waiting room, getting people to sign waivers and privacy concern waivers. And you want them to be able to do that with an iPad that, if left in the waiting room, wouldn't expose you to any kind of liability or risk, because your customers or your patients were able to pick up the device and they can't explore anything but the waiver that's on the screen. Legal environments, courtrooms, again, other places where security is a concern and you might want to have discrete control over what kind of data you share or who gets to access to the main system. Government, document management, these are all examples of solutions where discrete control over content and discrete control over access are really good scenarios for a 2-server setup. The next option for deployment we looked at was partially hosted. So this is another separation model. This is where we actually, though, are putting one FileMaker file on the device and one FileMaker file on the server. And this is much more, it's not for the same traditional reasons as I said before, but it could be. And that is, you could be doing this because you want to put graphics or other kinds of data into the local device just so that they don't have to traverse the network. If you imagine graphics and let's say value lists or other kinds of information stored here, then the iOS device just reads them locally. It doesn't have to go across the network to get the screens. The screens exist locally. It could be that there's a large data set, let's say of photos, or a large data set of raw text that doesn't change very often. And again, why send it across the network all the time if it can just reside on the device? Now again, all these things are trade-offs. There's storage constraints here, and if that file's big enough, it could start to consume significant storage here. But in general, what we found is the network is one of the biggest bottlenecks when it comes to performance and deployment. And so a lot of these deployment options really take into account how much data you're going to send across the network and when is it appropriate to mitigate that. So pros, reduces the amount of stuff that you have to send across the network. Schematic stuff would be like tables and records, and structural stuff would be like scripts and layouts. And so the options that are available to you by actually placing a file on the device that works in concert with a file back on a server is you have the ability to segregate what kind of information traverses the network and what doesn't. Downsides, there's still some sensitivity to network performance. You're going to hear that like a drumbeat every time we look at anything going across the cloud to get back to the server. Networks, like any highway, are going to have constraints. And primarily, schematic data is still going to come across. You may have some schematic data that you can put on the local device, like, for example, a table with some values that create a value list. But most of the time, when you do this kind of split, it's going to be that structural information, the layout, the scripts, those kinds of functions are going to be stored locally. But just like the other example where we split the files in two, this is a much more complicated development setup than you might be used to. And if you've been developing in the separation model since day one, this is preaching to the choir. You already know how to do that. But for someone who's unfamiliar with that, this will be a new set of skills to acquire. Account management, again, can be more complicated. In this case, we don't even have another directory environment. It's not like I have a server outside that I can connect to that can potentially store local accounts or security groups for me. This is totally separate FileMaker file-only security hosted on the iOS device. And then the final piece of this is now that the file is no longer on the server close to the administrators where the administrator can take the files down and bring them back up with updates, now if I want to update that remote file, I have to be familiar with the deployment options that are available for distributing files to iOS devices. And there's 3 or 4 different ways to get a file to an iOS device. And once you get it there, then there's a couple different approaches you can take to replacing the one that's already there. So this gets a little bit more complicated. If you want to get a new light file, if you want to get a new mobile file out to those mobile users, how do you get it to them? How do you get it to them all at once? Does that matter? How big is it? How do you update data that was stored locally with new data that's stored locally, if there's any data that's stored locally? There's just a lot of different things you have to take into consideration. Definitely want to keep an eye on the iOS resources section of the developer community. I know that issues of deployment have been mentioned in a number of FileMaker Go tech briefs, and I suspect we'll continue to see more information on that as the days progress. But it's not that hard to grasp how to get those files out there, but that's the mechanical part. There's a lot of process and procedure stuff to be grappled with as well. So what kinds of scenarios are good for partially hosted? A couple of examples I came up with: anything which has a relatively static but heavy data component. So that would be like an image library of some kind, or large value lists that are not in the value list table configuration, but maybe in tables in the database itself. Or anywhere where a historical data set would be useful, like I want entire sales history, or I want demographic data for this region, and then I'm going to introduce new data that I'm going to incorporate with it. Now, there's nothing about the separation model that prevents me from creating a new order for a customer and show it relative to their order history that I'm storing locally. Just because I'm entering the new order and it's really going into the remote file doesn't mean I can't relate it to or chart it with or otherwise blend it in some way with data that's locally stored on my device that shows historical perspective, or that I can't show orders for new products while I'm showing images about those products that are stored locally. So all these come down to design techniques, but if it's got a static and heavy component, that's a real good candidate. And if it has a graphically rich interface, if you feel that despite the various design tips out there about keeping things simple, that you really need to have a fairly sophisticated interface here with a lot of graphics on it, it's a really good opportunity for you to mitigate what is effectively a whole bunch of network traffic just to make the screens draw. It allows that all to take place locally. It also means that if you have less storage on the device and information has to be read out of the file into the temp frequently because the temp file is small, the round trip necessary to do that is a lot smaller. So examples might be product ordering, where there's a companion catalog of images, or any application you can think of where there's a graphically rich interface. I think we had a customer who does a lot in the healthcare industry, looking at existing healthcare facilities and sort of comparing them to other healthcare facilities in the area, and there's a significant volume of data that they do to perform their comparisons. Well, if they could take that comparison data with them as sort of a large data set, that sort of demographics kind of content set, that would be a really great example where they didn't have a graphically rich demand, but they definitely had a lot of related data that they wanted to have handy so that the mobile user could actually perform, analysis, not just simple data entry. 2 more to go. Next one is the synchronization model. So the idea here is you have 2 files, one on the server and one on the device, and they may be very similar or very different, but the main idea here is that they're not tethered and connected to each other. From the moment you open them, they really are separate files, and it's only when the user wants to synchronize data, to send data up and pull down updates, that happens. Whereas in the previous models, the presumption is that when you opened up that external file, it was probably connected right at the outset with that remote file, that the file on your device or the file on that second server outside the firewall had a persistent kind of tether, and that was optimized to kind of reduce the amount of traffic, but it was still subject to interruption. Whereas this is sort of an on-demand, like a light switch. It's on, it's off, you sync. So pros and cons here. Well, you can greatly reduce the amount of network traffic because you're storing pretty much everything you need locally, and only at the sync moments are you actually sending data across the network. All the graphics and all the data that you have eventually come to rest in the file that you have on your iOS device. Another great benefit here is that it isolates that network traffic when you want it to happen. So you can deliberately trigger that when you've got a good, strong signal, or when you're not moving on a train or not in a plane at 30,000 feet. You can actually deliberately decide when those connection intents are going to be made. Any of those other solutions, which are kind of tethered solutions, they're going to find themselves subject to interruption that you can't control. You just happen to get into the elevator and forget that you're connected, and boom, you lost the calls, and you also lost your connection. It also can mitigate some of the impact of calls. You know, if you think about those other solutions, a phone call that interrupts your tethered connection, you're hopeful that when you come out of that phone call, that connection can be restored and you won't lose any of the data that you might have been sending across or getting from the other side. But in this kind of environment, unless you're actually doing a sync, and in fact, if your sync is orchestrated properly, which I know some of the sync utilities that have been developed for the community take this into account, you're kind of really reducing your risk. The risk that you're going to get interrupted, the risk that you're going to get interrupted during a critical transfer of data are relatively small because you can pick those moments. You can kill your cell coverage and then do a sync. Or you could have your cell coverage and do a sync and know that the data is still on your device. It didn't get broken in transit, or it wasn't lost because it hadn't yet been committed to the other end. And of course, it lets you work offline. You can access and manipulate your data when you're 30,000 feet, when you're down in the basement of a building with no Wi-Fi signal and no 3G signal. You're effectively unlimited in your ability to work with that data offline, and then when you want to, send it back. I mean, unlimited other than the, whatever features aren't supported on Go. So downsides of this, definitely can complicate development and account management. I know that some of the syncing tools that are available have made it relatively easy for you to kind of drop syncing into your solution and follow simple instructions to kind of get syncing working. But there's some trade-offs. You may not have as much control over the look and feel of that experience. You may not understand how it works and need to be able to explain that to your own client or your internal customers. You're certainly going to have account management. Again, the device has got the file, so you have to manage those accounts locally on the device within the actual file. You can't rely on an open or Active Directory environment. And then just like the previous example, if you want to get a new file out to those people in the field, now you have another set of issues to contend with. Not just how do you get it to them, but what do you do with the data that's already in the file? What if they haven't synced it yet? All these things that there may be easy answers for, but they may not be comfortable for you. You may still have to learn some new development skills to be able to really manage them and orchestrate them to behave the way you want them to. So usage scenarios that are good for synchronization. Anytime you're going to be off the grid, out of range, or otherwise not in control of your network access. We've all been to a customer site or a client site or a vendor site where, or even a coffee shop where they just don't have the internet that you can use. It's too hard to get the IT group to give you a key, or everything's restricted to the MAC addresses of the devices that are known, and so, or maybe it's just the signal is terrible where you are, or you're about to take off and they've asked you to put your device away. Whatever it is, if you need to be able to work offline, this is a great scenario for you, synchronization. And anywhere else that you think that even if you're going to have access, you can't risk being cut off. You just don't want an interruption. You don't want communication has been lost with the host. You don't want to risk losing an iota of data. Reliability can really drive this decision as well. It may be that you could work connected, but you just can't risk losing one record. So that would be another good example. So we find that this is great when you're going on site and doing project management tasks and you have no idea whether or not the conference room you're going into or the customer site you're going to will actually offer you Wi-Fi. For inspectors, people who are going to be working off-site in homes or in other kinds of environments where there may not be any wireless signal, they may have to go into basements or into elevators or other kinds of places where walls are thick and signal is low. Or even for that matter where you're not allowed to use signal, or you're being asked to, don't use cell phones. And it could be another great example of where if you don't require a Wi-Fi or a cell signal and you can turn yourself into airplane mode, but you can still use your database, synchronization is a great option for you. Delivery services, people mobile and moving around, again, on the road, hitting dead spots and so on, great examples. And then anyone who travels, if you've got salespeople or healthcare workers or inspectors or delivery drivers or anybody who has to gather data in the field, and then wants to send it back when they're ready and never find themselves halfway through doing their data entry and losing a connection, synchronization is a choice for you. The last example we have as we wrap things up here is the fully offline model. So there is no server. There's just you and your iOS device and your database. So the best thing about this is it doesn't care what kind of network you do or don't have. There's only a few steps, and this may not be all of them, but steps like using web viewers or OpenURL or the send mail script step or maybe even import where you ever potentially open up that network can of worms. Otherwise, everything you need to do is isolated and local to the device. There's not even a sync button. You're just kind of working offline. Now, the downside of that, again, account management. If you want to send this file out to all your people and give them accounts, then of course you have to create accounts in all those files. Then there's also the question of what happens when someone gets fired or terminated. How do you remove their access? So that gets complicated in this environment, and that's really true of any situation where they have a file that's distributed remotely to the device. Same as before, application update procedures. Really hard to get updates. If not hard, it's just something you have to contend with. So it should be clear. These things aren't hard to do. They just may not be familiar, and they're certainly not as simple as the model we're used to, which is just host the file on the server and log in. Another big con is that the application file is not shared. It's a standalone copy. So we're not syncing this back to someplace. We're not pooling our data. If I get my data back to some central HQ, it's through email or some other approach that sends the data out of my database and gives it to someone else who then has to bring it into the database. It's not in any way a shared multi-user kind of setup. So this is definitely off the reservation when it comes to what we normally think of as FileMaker for ease of use and sharing. Suddenly it becomes a little bit of a silo. It's its own standalone copy of the database, and you don't get to share data with anybody. And probably one of the biggest cons of this is that now you're not getting the server's help at all. FileMaker Server is exceptionally good at managing indexes. That means it can import data more efficiently. It can perform find operations and provide a list of IDs more efficiently. It can just do a lot more, and it's got a lot more horsepower than the relatively weaker processors on the iOS device. So by doing a fully offline model, and even the previous sync model, you really don't gain a lot of the benefits you would otherwise get from a FileMaker server. Even the sync model at times can take benefits to the server when it comes to sending data up or pulling the new records down. But in this model, the server is not a part of it. So all it is whatever the device can do, that's what you can do. So where might this be appropriate? When you have static or published information, information that you just want to be able to review offline and share, it could be samples or portfolio or perhaps data that you need to consume like contracts or other kinds of things where it doesn't need to move. It just came from a database and you'd like it to stay there. Maybe that's the end of life for it. It comes to you and then when you're done you delete it. But if it's published and complete and exists elsewhere. Another would be when email is an acceptable way of sending data back. So maybe it's okay for you to have a fully offline product catalog and then there's an order form and it just emails a PDF of the order to someone back at HQ who then processes the order by hand. Not as efficient as we might want, not as productive as we might want, but still functional and could be effective. And if that is, maybe they're not even using FileMaker for their data entry. I know it's terrible to say, but maybe they've got a legacy system, but they had an offline file that had their catalog and let people take orders, and then it ends up going into the legacy system anyway. An offline solution could potentially be very good. There could be very low security concerns. It's all about having the device and being able to just open it and log in and send an email with the final result. Interactive brochure portfolios, those kinds of things. Really what it comes down to is where you can effectively, I think of this, when I think of this, I think of a book, or I think of an adjunct to an existing legacy system, whether it's FileMaker or other. If those kinds of scenarios work for you and being able to work offline no matter what is appealing, then the fully offline model might be a good deployment scenario. So on the next few slides, I'm going to share just a couple more images, and then I'm going to pass the ball back here to Jason for our question and answer. I'm going to give you my 2 cents and take on different deployment models and where they fit relative to one another on 2 different axes. One is how hard are they to develop, and again, not maybe subjectively hard. How hard are they developed compared to the traditional model we have of just developing a single file? And then also how they might stack up to one another in terms of relative performance. If all things were equal and you took advantage of all the different performance benefits that you can get from reading and studying, optimizing iOS apps for performance, or FileMaker Go apps for performance, if all that was the same, which one might perform better than the other if you built the same solution and deployed it different ways? These are my opinions. Your mileage may vary, and I've got 2, one for how I think things will behave on the LAN, and one for how I think things will behave on the WAN. And I should mention that there was a glitch in one of these drawings when I did the first round of the presentation, and that has been fixed in this round. So the first one is how I think they stack up when you look at them on the WAN. Remember now, the WAN means the network here is a significantly larger contributor to the performance profile, that the WAN is less reliable and more constrained. So in this environment, if we look left to right, faster on the left and slower on the right in terms of performance, models that work with offline data, synchronizing or fully offline, will generally perform faster because they have no network effect. Not in every operation, not in everything that they do. If they're partially hosted, there's an opportunity for them to be a little faster because you can have all that structural and data local, like the layouts and the graphics and the scripts. So this is not fully offline, but it gets some of the benefits because it's partially offline. And then finally, anything that's hosted on a server that's across a WAN is certainly going to be subject to network interruptions and network constraints that the other models won't. When we look at the development complexity, my general feeling has been that with easier at the bottom and harder at the top, if you're dealing with sync or you're dealing with multiple files or you're dealing with multiple files, any of these multiple file options are going to be a little bit harder and more complex than ones where you're using a standalone file locally or a standalone file on a one-server model. So the way to really read this is left to right, top to bottom, and I've just kind of put things either in an appropriate quadrant based on very rough characterizations of their relative performance and relative ease of complexity or lack thereof in developing them. On the LAN side, things get a little bit different because on the LAN, the hosted environments really can take advantage. And by LAN, I mean LAN. Some of these actually apply both to Go and Pro, but I would assume now we're talking Wi-Fi in a controlled environment. So in these environments, you can get actually pretty good performance on fully hosted. Now you get the server to do some more work for you. You have a fatter network pipe, even though it's Wi-Fi, to push the data across, and you're not worried about as many risks or constraints because the opportunity for interruption to your signal is relatively low. Whereas on the right side, the synchronizing models now, they have to send data on purpose to the server. They don't send data at all to the server, and so they don't offer quite the same performance profile because they're really local apps. And then only occasionally do they take advantage of what the server has to offer. And then, of course, partially hosted is right there in the middle again. And then vertically, it's a little easier. If you're just developing for fully hosted one file, that's a lot easier than maybe doing two. And same thing, just working with a fully offline file is going to be relatively easier than having to incorporate sync into your solution. So use these maybe as a relative positioning when it comes to, well, how much skills do I need? How many different kinds of skills? How many different complicating factors will I have to include if I take this particular approach? And you're going to want to factor that in as you consider which model fits for all the different reasons they might work or not. So finally, I'll recommend a couple resources. FileMaker Training Series is a great resource for self-teaching and learning the FileMaker solutions. And of course, authorized trainers like Skeleton Key and others in the authorized trainer community are great resources. I certainly recommend coming back to FileMaker Academy again. We're going to continue to offer really important and useful content from these different platinum-level companies. There's also Module 13 that came out in the last year or so for FileMaker Training Series, which specifically addresses FileMaker Go and developing in FileMaker Go, so I'd recommend that as well. There's a number of demos and resources at the FileMaker Go resources page on FileMaker's website. And then finally, there's a developer community where you can find those how-to articles like the one I mentioned on iOS application and database performance, and you'll continue to see more and more out there about using FileMaker Go and how to deploy your files. You can certainly stay in sync with us and send questions or suggestions about this or any other FileMaker Academy event to info@skeletonkey.com. Keep an eye on Twitter or our blog, Facebook, and LinkedIn if you would like to see any updates. I know that some of the questions we had, I had some follow-up answers on the 29th, so I've already put some of those up onto my Twitter feed, and that's being retweeted onto Skeleton Keys, so that's a great place to stay tuned. And also to stay on top of what's coming next for FileMaker Academy.